This is my attempt to try to make a dress easy to make and easy to wear. This tutorial is meant for someone who is new to dressmaking. This dress has easy cut-on sleeves and no zipper, so it should be really easy for a beginner to make. I really hope you enjoy this video, and let's sew this dress. I had 3 yards of this 55-inch wide gingham linen fabric from Joann. It's folded in half lengthwise, and here is the fold. I wanted to save 2 yards for the skirt, so here I am trying to fit bodice pieces and pocket pieces in 1 yard. For the bodice, I'm using my base pattern. You can download it for free from the link below. I'm folding it at the hemline A. This is the hemline for a crop top. I'm going to cut the front bodice on fold, so I'm excluding the seam allowance, which is the shaded area. Align the center front line with the folded line. On the back bodice pattern, do the same thing and fold at the hemline A. I rotated the pattern piece to fit in the tight space, but if your fabric is directional, you can't do this, so buy a little bit more fabric if you choose fabric with directional patterns or naps. I made a pattern for a pocket, and this is the first generation of it. After making this dress, I made some changes to make it better, and the latest version of this pocket pattern is downloadable for free from the link in the description box. This is a very basic shape for a seam pocket, and you can add this pocket to many different garments. I think I'm going to cut pockets here and here. This is the front bodice pattern. It's facing down on the fabric and it's folded at the hemline A. I'm going to add some shaping to it before cutting. I'm going to add 1.5 inch at the center and blend it to the hemline A at the side. This is to accommodate your chest contour, so if you're smaller chested, I would add 1 inch here, and if you're bigger chested, you can add up to 2 inches. The bottom of the side seam is at the middle of the gray stripe here, so I'm placing the bottom of the side seam on the back bodice at the center of the gray stripe too. So I completely forgot about the bias binding tape. So I think I'll try to get the 4 pocket pieces from here like this. It's not on grain, but I'll keep this on the horizontal grain of the fabric. Because the fabric is on fold here, I think I'll have enough fabric to make bias binding for the neckline. I cut the center back with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here I'm cutting out 2 inch wide bias strips. Bias strips are fabric strips cut out on 45-degree angle. I'm going to use this to finish neckline. If you don't have a cutting mat with a bias guideline, use a transparent ruler and align the 2 corners of a square with a grain line. You want to stretch the bias strips before use. Iron the strips really well with steam. This will prevent the wrinkling and stretching of the bias tape when you bind the neckline. Originally, I was planning to use the fabric width as the width for the skirt, but when I held it up in front of the mirror, I felt that it was too much fabric. The amount of fabric you would want to use will probably depend on the weight of your fabric and the final look you're after. I decided to use 43 inches for the width for the front and the back skirt. So I cut out 2 panels which were 43 inches wide and 36 inches long. Here are all the pieces I cut out. 1 front piece on fold. I added 1.5 inches to the center front and blended to the hemline A at the side. I cut 2 back pieces. The center back has 1/2 inch seam allowance. And 2 skirt panels. Each one measures 43 inches in width and 36 inches in length. 4 pocket pieces. Ideally, you cut them on grain, but I cut them out perpendicular to the vertical grain. You can also cut pocket pieces from another fabric. And 2-inch wide bias tape. You can combine them to make a longer piece that is long enough to bind the neckline. Serge or zigzag stitch the raw edges. Do all edges except for the neckline and the waistline. If you don't have a serger, set your sewing machine to do wide zigzag stitch or overlock stitch. Use a hand wheel to move the needles to the utmost position to make a turn when you're serging. Before sewing the bodice together, fold and iron the 1-inch sleeve hem. I try to iron as much as possible before pieces are sewn together. It's much easier to iron accurately at this stage. Put right sides of the back bodice pieces together to sew the center back seam. Measure down 3.5 inches from the top and place the pin to mark the place. And sew the center back seam with 1/2 inch seam allowance below the pin. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning. Hold the fabric in front and behind the needle and only slightly stretch the fabric to keep it taut under the needle. And let your sewing machine feed the fabric naturally. Whenever you need to move the pin or fiddle with the fabric, turn the hand wheel towards you to place the needle in the fabric so the stitch line won't wiggle. Backstitch again at the end of the stitch. For a more professional looking finish, it's important to iron your seam as you go. Iron the seam allowances open on the wrong side and fold 1/2 inch seam allowances at the top of the center back seam. Stitch down the seam allowance of the back neck opening. The back neck opening is done and now we sew the shoulders. Put the front and the back bodices with right side of the fabric together and sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance. I flared out the stitch from the fold so the edge of the hem has enough length when folded up. Iron the seam allowances open. If you can't cut out one long piece of bias strip, combine two short ones to get a strip long enough to cover the neckline. I love my sewing roller. It's very handy to press small sections like this. Time to apply the bias strip to bind the neckline. Leave some extra strip at the beginning so we can wrap the edge later. Check where you sew the strips together to make sure you are placing the right side of the bias strip to the right side of the bodice piece. Align the edges of the bias strip and the neckline a couple inches at a time. Align the edges, sew a little bit, keep the needle in the fabric, and rotate the piece. Repeat this until you get to the other end. Leave about 5/8 of an inch and cut off the excess bias strip. Trim the seam allowances to 1/4 inch wide. And then measure 5/8 of an inch on the other side and trim the bias strip. Before cutting through where I connected the two bias strips, I put some freight check and let it dry. This connecting seam ended up in a less than perfect place. I really don't want extra bulk at the edge because I'll be folding and wrapping the end. But I'm too lazy to redo the whole neckline, so I'm gonna try to reduce the bulk as much as possible. If you find it hard to start stitching on the folded layers like this, place the needle 1/4 or 1/2 inch inside the edge and start with back stitching. When you have tight curves like this, clip the seam allowances of both the bias strip and the bodice neckline. Here I'm folding the bias strip so you can see just a hair of the bodice neckline. This way you don't see any of the bias strip from the outside of the garment. After the neckline is done, sew the underarm seams. I flared out the stitch at the sleeve hem in the same way as the shoulder seam. I opened the seam allowances of the underarm seam and went ahead and sewed the sleeve hems. Iron the neckline and the sleeve hem from the inside of the garment. Tailor's hem is very useful for ironing curved seams. Use the white side for crisp fabric like linen. Using your fingers and iron, stretch the edge of the seam allowance. Once you stretch the seam allowance inside, the underarm lays nicely. The difference is clear compared to the side I have not stretched yet. Now is a good time to try on your bodice. Look at the hemline of the front and the back. If one side hangs longer, you can adjust it now. I like the shaping of my front bodice, but I wanted to smooth out this shape more. Then I was looking at the sleeve opening and thinking, this doesn't look like the top I made from the same pattern. And I finally realized that I missed transferring some of the changes to the pattern after making those changes to the garment, which was shown in the first video. In some panic mode, I quickly made those changes to the pattern and test printed the edited version, feeling horrible for people who had already printed the pattern and actually made the top. And of course, my iPad kept crashing, and my 3-year-old son tried to help me by pulling the prints out of the printer, and when I tried to reprint the whole 18 pages, this message showed up. But all is good now. After the hiatus, the edited version of the pattern is up on my website. And here is what you can do if you already made the top and thought the sleeves were too wide. Basically, you want to shave 2.5 inches from the underarm. I used the edited version of the pattern as a template to draw the new underarm line. But you can also freehand the line. I also fixed the front bodice hem. Place one of the pocket pieces 4 inches down from the skirt waist with right sides of fabric facing each other. Do the same thing on the other side, and sew with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and also serge or zigzag both layers together. Do this on both the front and the back skirt pieces. Place one on top of the other with right sides together and sew the side seams and pockets together. Serge or zigzag both layers together. Iron the seam allowances toward the front skirt. I want to add 4 pleats in the front. So I'm going to divide the front into 5 evenly. The front length came out to be 25 inches. So I marked every 5 inches for the pleat placements. I lined up the center marks of the front bodice and the front skirt to see the amount of excess fabric on the skirt. I had 8 inches more on the skirt, so divide that between the 2 pleats on the one side. One pleat would be 4 inches wide. I measured 5 inches from the side seam, 4 inches for the pleat width, 5 inches between the pleats, and 4 inches for another pleat. Do this on the other side and on the back skirt too. I pinned all the pleats, made sure the skirt lined up with the bodice well, and machine basted all the pleats. Flip the skirt inside out and then place it over the bodice so the right sides of the fabric is facing each other. Line up the center front and the center back and side seams. And sew the bodice and the skirt with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here is the first try on. This was okay, but I wanted to make it more high-waisted. The weight of the skirt is pulling down the bodice, and after attaching the skirt, the top usually looks longer than you thought when you were trying on just the top part. So back to the table with my seam ripper. I unpicked the waist seam and cut off 1.5 inch from the bodice hem all around. It's easy to move around the waist because the pleats on the skirt are in place with machine basting. I also cut off 4 inches from the skirt bottom, serged and turned up 1 inch for the hem finishing. It's really easy to make changes to this design to suit your personal style. Add elastics or a belt to the waist for more shaping. Make the skirt shorter, make a gathered skirt instead of pleats, or combine with my tiered skirt tutorial to make a tiered dress. If you are still here, thank you so much for watching my video to the end. Please leave a comment and give the video a like to help me spread the sewing love. Also, please tag me on Instagram if you make a dress and post it there, because I'd love to see your creation. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.